I want to encourage you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 13, especially those of you watching online. That real, like the physical one, you get that too. Open up to Genesis chapter 13 and follow with us in the story. We're going to continue. We had begun this series, Fearless Trust. And I told you in a year of 2023, the theme is fearlessness. And if there's anything that's going to eat your lunch in a year like this year, it is finances. Am I right? Or provision. If there's any place that probably causes us some levels of anxiety, a little bit of, it's the thoughts of inflation, thoughts of job loss, thoughts of you name it. And this is an area all through Scripture where God continues to continue to reveal himself. I am a God who can be trusted in this area called provision. Let me be your provider. This series is a three-part series starting with Abraham. And so we're looking at Abram's life and how God was with Abram first. And we're talking about this partnership. Then we'll talk about Israel as God brought them out of Egypt, how he showed himself in a place, a wilderness where there was nothing, how he is the provider, even in a place of absolute nothing. And then we're going to talk about how God brought Israel into the promised land. And even as he brought them into the promised land, how he revealed himself in a place of plenty, in a place where they had a whole lot and they were covered. How he said, hey, listen, I'm still your God, and I want you to understand what it is to serve me in a time of plenty, a time of wilderness, a time of introduction. And so we began with blessed to be a blessing. It started with a call of Abraham, chapter 12. God called a guy, there was no backdrop to this conversation. There was no history to this conversation, very little bit. You could try to follow his ancestry in the book of Genesis all the way back, but really, he chose him by grace. And he called him out and said, this is who I am, and this is what I want to do in your life, and this is what I want to do through your life. I want to bless you, and I want you to be a blessing. And he began to preach to Abram the gospel that would reach us all the way in our day today, that through your line is going to come one who's going to bring about my blessing on all mankind, on all nations. It's the gospel. And so we asked the important question, what is your story? What is your story? Because you and I, we cannot have any good conversations about kingdom principles on provision and finance and putting God first and sacrifice and tithes and offerings and any of that stuff. We can't have a conversation like that in a healthy manner if we don't start with the basics of who are you and what is your story? Everything we do flows out of this picture. What is your story is the conversation that happens in the back of your mind, the narrator of your own life story. What does it say? What do you say to yourself? What's the conversation? That I'm blessed? Is that your story? That I'm blessed? Like the gospel message that I was saved by grace through faith in Jesus. I was given an inheritance, brought into a family, adopted into the family of God, promised the world for eternity so he could just continue to bless my life. Like that's my story. Is that your story? Because if that's not your story, some other storyline is the backdrop of your life. And if it's not the gospel as the backdrop of your life, everything else about this provision conversation is going to get really hard. Are you with me? And so that's why it's so important. So we began with that. What is the story of your life? Are you blessed? Is that the story you tell yourself? Is that the story that defines your journey? Well, we don't have time to read it, so I got to give you a little bit of history. Before we jump into chapter 13, chapter 12 continued. We just talked about the call of Abram. It's before he's named Abraham later, so if I go back and forth between Abram and Abraham, that's okay. Just know it's the same guy, okay? Just a different part of his journey. But in the story, he says, I want you to leave everything. I want you to leave your place of comfort. I want you to leave your people. I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave everything you've got and go to his place I'm going to show you one day, because this is what I want to do. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your inheritance. I'm going to bless offspring coming after you. I have this plan to bless you, and then through you to bless the world. And Abram, big step of faith, packs it all up, leaves the Chaldeans, and heads off to Canaan. Heads off to this place that God would show him, and he finally arrives. And this is still chapter 12. He arrives in the place. God meets him again, says, this is what I intend to do. Let me just remind you of my intention for your life. And so Abram builds an altar in that place. And then he settles down in a spot between Bethel and Ai, it says, in the land of Canaan. And he builds another altar to the Lord. And it says, in this place, he called on the name of the Lord. And this is the first reference we have to this, calling on the name of the Lord. That means he not only made a place, but the place that he was going to go to regularly to worship his God and make a declaration, Yahweh is my God. In a land that did not know Yahweh. In a land that had no idea of God revealing himself with this particular name, who he is the God Most High, the God of heaven. They had no idea. It's just Abram. And he builds an altar in the middle of this land. And he calls on the name of the Lord. Then he is faced with his very first test. How many of you know if we're going to be fearless in the area of provision, we're going to have to go through some seasons of learning to trust God in the area of provision? Are you with me? Anybody ever been tested in your finances before? I'm just curious, kind of across the board. It's always fun, right? It's enjoyable. These are the times we relish these moments. We know. It says right off the bat, he's tested by a famine in the land. And this great man of faith who was willing to trust God to move everything away that he had, everything away from all of the security, all of the provision, move everything. This great man of faith faces a famine, and the first thing he does, he can trust God for the big stuff, but now it's the everyday stuff for my family. And instead of seeking the Lord about it, he just does what probably a lot of us have done, maybe still do, maybe are inclined to do. He just handled it with the wisdom he had. Things are rough around here, so I'm just going to go to a better place. And he leaves the promised place. He leaves this place where God says, I'm going to provide for you here. I'm going to bless you. This is going to belong to you. He leaves that place and goes off to Egypt. And in Egypt, he makes all kinds of mistakes. So one, he's not trusting God for his financial provision. Anybody been there before? Makes a decision that just seems to make sense. I'll go to a place that they got a lot over there. I'm going to go over there. And in that, he tells his wife, hey, listen, I'm a little concerned that you're so beautiful, they'll probably kill me to get you. Because Pharaoh, he gets the pick of the litter. So here's the deal. And so he puts her at harm's risk. And eventually, it all happens like it said. He says, pretend you're my sister, or say that you're my sister. Pharaoh takes her into his house, blesses him, and says, here, Abram, I'm going to give you lots because she's so beautiful and she's your sister. Great, you're connected to her, good. And he gets even more stuff. And in that, God shows up and says, don't you dare touch her to Pharaoh. Puts plagues on the house of Pharaoh. Does that sound familiar? Precursor to what's going to happen later. And this man of faith, who is meant to be a blessing, out of fear, is now being rebuked by a pagan king. What the heck were you thinking telling me she's your sister? And he's like, well, da-da-da. And he says, get on out of here. And he gets him on out of there, gives him more stuff as he goes. Sound familiar? Egypt, coming out of Egypt, Israel, gives him more stuff as he goes and makes him ridiculously wealthy, sends him back, and it says in chapter 13 where we pick up, he is right back exactly where he started in the land of Canaan, in the very place he built the altar. We make a lot of decisions in fear. I learn a lot about what I trust when my provision is threatened, when finances are tight. It shows some stuff real fast. How much is he the God I call on, Or how much do I rely on my own self to figure stuff out? Are you with me? And so this lesson today that we look at, he passes with flying colors. This is lesson number 2, test number 2, I should say. And this time, Abram passes with flying colors. He's about to experience a moment that, if he handles it wrong, could bring a complete division to his family. Fighting over money in the family. That's what happens today. Are you with me? And Abram chooses a different route than a lot have chosen in the past. How many of you have ever known anybody, any family that's ever been split or relationships messed up over money or inheritance? Just raise your hand if you know of anybody, because it's not you, I know that. I mean other families, like your neighbors across the street. Yeah, you know. Okay, great. So if you know anybody, this is the moment Abram is facing, another opportunity for a tremendous family strife, split, major issue. And instead of letting it happen, Abram passes this test. He chooses to prefer another. He's able to. Why is he able to? By prefer, I mean put somebody else before you. Before you. Our culture is all about getting yours. Am I right? It's all about getting yours. From a parking place to a promotion, it's all about getting yours. Right? Or into the fast lane faster, the carpool lane before somebody else. It's all about getting yours. That's the culture we live in. If you're going to live a life that prefers other people, puts other people first, then you have to have a storyline in the back of your head that is a better story. And that's where we pick it up. After a major failure, we pick the story up. 3 things we'll learn from him. 1, remember God's grace in our lives. We've got to remember God's grace. We've got to recalibrate to eternal priorities. And 3, we've got to receive God's vision for our lives. And that's what Abram does. That's where he's at. So let's read about remembering God's grace. The first 4 verses, it says, so Abram, he went up from Egypt. Remember why he was in Egypt in the first place, right? Famine, afraid, go there. What the heck are you doing? Who are you? Who do you, what how could you even say this? Get out of here. I'm leaving Egypt now. He leaves Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot, his nephew, with him, and he went back into the Negev. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock. And by the way, when he says very rich in livestock, in the ancient Near Eastern culture, this idea of rich, if you're rich, you've got maybe 30 to 60 tents. You've got 1,000 sheep. That's rich. To be very rich means you've got hundreds of tents probably. That's the caravan. That's when you set up, when you spread out, you're spread out with your livestock. It says he's very rich. He's got thousands and thousands of livestock. He's got tents upon tents. He is a living tent city himself. Just his family, servants, all of that. There's hundreds of people represented here. He's not little. He's very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. That's the important part. Between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at first. And there, Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Why is this so important? I believe for us, all of us, this isn't like a one-time thing. Remembering God's grace in our life is not a one-time thing. I did it, I remembered once. It's a pretty continual thing. And for Abram, coming out of a time of total, like he blew it, major failure, and yet God still was kind to him. God brought him out of that. God brought him through that, actually blessed and not hurt, damaged by all of that. Now, there were a lot of other effects we don't have time to get into. There were causes. There was some stuff that he carried. There was some long-term baggage that came out of being in Egypt. But he brought them out, and he brought them back to the place where it began, where he remembered God's grace, where he acknowledged God's grace in his life, and he acknowledged that Yahweh is my God. Right back to that altar, right back to that place. And there, like before, again, he called on the name of Yahweh, the name of the Lord. Question this morning is, who do you call on? When I say who do you call on, it means who is like God in your life, especially this area of provision? Who is the one that you say, he's the one who provides for me. He's the one I trust. He's the one, or it's the one, or this is the thing. What do you trust in? Because worship and love, or I should say love and trust, is where worship flows from. That's where it flows from. Who we love or who we trust is where our worship flows from. If it's God, our worship flows from that because he's the one I trust and he's the one I love. And everything flows out of that. If it's not God, then what I worship, you'll find ends up not being God at all. It flows from who we love and who we trust. And he's saying, I'm coming right back. You're the one I love. You're the one I trust. It's you coming back to the beginning. Some of you Bible scholars remember in Revelation chapter 2, right? Jesus has a series of letters that he has written to churches current in that day. One in Ephesus in particular. In chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, he talks to them about remembering and repenting. He says, guys, you got a lot going on for you that's really good. You're serving, you're active, it's great. People are giving of themselves, it's awesome. You guys are fighting like doctrinal heresy, trying to get into the church. You're fighting culture, compromise, trying to find its way into the church. You're doing all of this, great, good for you. But I got one thing against you, and it's such a big deal, it's a game changer. Your church is not gonna exist tomorrow if you don't deal with this one thing. You with me? You're doing so much right, and you're in the right culturally. You're in the right doctrinally, but none of that matters. Your church is not going to exist tomorrow. I will remove the lampstand if you don't address the one thing. The one thing is this: return to your first love. Remember the beginning. And go back to that place and do the things you did at first. Because if you don't, I'll remove your lampstand. What is that? It's that place of grace. It's the story of your life. Everything that matters to God, that is significant about our life, flows from our understanding of God's grace. Everything that's going to make a difference in the world comes out of our humility, our gratitude for the grace of God in our life. It's that big a deal. Abram comes all the way back to the beginning. And I start there with us today. What he does next in his conflict resolution, what he does next is only possible because he remembers where he came from and what God has done for him. Have you discovered God's grace, the gospel in your own life? Is that your story? Because if it is, fantastic. This next part makes sense to you. If it's not your story, this next part will not only not make sense to you, what I say to you will be so countercultural, it'll be irritating. Are you with me? Secondly, he recalibrated to priorities. It says this, and Lot, who went with him, remember it's his nephew, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great they could not dwell together. So there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. And Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we're kinsmen, we're family. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right, or if you go to the right hand, I will go to the left. And here's this picture then. They're both so wealthy. They cannot stay together and commingle all their tents and commingle all their livestock. There's just so much. There's so much now that there's fighting among the servants. Hey, your camel's eating grass on my side of the fence. Hey, your sheep are grazing over here. Hey, you mixed up your goats with my goats. No, that's my speckled goat. No, that's my speckled goat. Hey, we get access to water rights to the well first. You parked in front of my house. And it's getting so bad, he just steps in and says, hey, listen, we're family. And in this picture, two things are brought to the surface as priorities. It talks about the strife between Abram and Lot, and in particular, their servants. But it also talks about those who are dwelling in the land. The Perizzites and the Canaanites, it says, and makes a point to say they're also all around. What does that mean? They're watching what we're doing. There are people around us that are watching who we are. And we are the one representative of Yahweh in the land. We're it. And what do they see? Fighting. Two priorities come out of this. One is our testimony, and two is our relationships. Abram says, in a sense, money and land are not more important than our relationship. I got one, it's right. Anybody else agree with that? Inheritance is not more important than our family relationships. Mom's house that went to you, dad's car that went to so-and-so, their 401k plan that got divided unequally between so-and-so is not more important than our relationships. Anybody? Are you sure you agree with that? Our world doesn't agree with that. But Abram says these relationships, we're family. Not only that, our testimony to these people around us is more important than land and money. Our testimony. Let me say that again. Our testimony is more important than money. Are you sure you agree with that? You don't have to agree with me just because it's me. I mean, I'm just trying to make this scripture come alive to our hearts today in 2023. How many fights are happening in the office? How many grumbling, whining complaints around the water cooler over pay and who gets more, and I should have got this and that. And if that is the church, what the heck? What is your testimony? What do people hear? Who is your God? Do you live your life in such a way where Yahweh is your God, He's your provider, that people look at you and go, how could you have so much peace in a time of recession? How could you be so okay with whatever? Content with your wages? Why are you so different? Why aren't you having the same conversation everybody else is having about how to get theirs? What makes you different? Is that the conversation that people see when they talk to you? Our testimony is more important than money. Anybody agree with that yet? Is it getting through? In one place, Paul says to the Corinthian church, guys, when he talks about testimony, he says, you should be embarrassed. He says, church, you should be embarrassed over this. You guys are fighting over money, and you're taking these matters to the courts before unrighteous judges. Two Christians, two brothers in the body of Christ are bringing financial matters that they're fighting over into a court before an unrighteous judge. What do you think they see about the testimony? What does it say about who your God is and what you believe about your life? Does it say that I'm blessed? God's got me, so I can get you? Or does it say I got to get my own because you're taking from me? And nobody takes from me. I fight for my rights. I know someone wanted me to say it. And Paul says, the fact that you have divisions already, you're losing. The fact that you defraud each other and take from each other, you're losing. He says, is there not like people in the church that you can have a conversation with and they can help you sort it out? Don't you know you're going to judge angels? Don't you know the church is going to actually judge the world? Like, that's part of the responsibility. Your testimony. And 2, family. He says to the Philippian church, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. That is such a hard pill to swallow in our culture. In our culture. More significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. In the church, we have this thing called the law of love that we live by. Written out for us by Jesus, explained and expounded upon by Paul, that constrains the way we treat each other and live our lives. This law of love. And he says, in the law of love, here's what it is. Consider others more significant than yourself. That's what it means to prefer another. And in this story, Abram had all the rights as the patriarch. Lot had no rights as the patriarch. He had no rights to say anything. He could do whatever Abram told him to do. And yet Abram, the one with all the patriarchal rights, says to Lot, hey, Lot, listen, hey, our testimony is more important than this stuff. And our family, our relationship is more important than this stuff. I'll tell you, I'm going to prefer you. You do what you want to do as far as where you want to go. You can take this side, you can go over that area, you pick the best of the land. Wherever you think is best, you do that, and I'll do something else. Why? Because God's got me. I've learned this lesson. God's got me. He has already promised to bless me. The story of my life is the story of grace. So therefore, you do what you want, and man, I can prefer that. I can say also, what are your needs? And be excited for you. Be happy for you. Paul says some words in 1 Corinthians. I didn't read the passage, but he says these words, why not rather be wronged? And I think those words hit me the hardest, like they just jump off the page. Why not rather be wronged? Anybody feel the good old American something and you go, no, heck no. There's no rather be wronged. Are you with me? There's something about that is so counterculture, but he said, why not rather just be wronged? Why not just be defrauded? Why not let them have more? Is your testimony worth more than that, what they owe you? Is your relationship worth more than what they took from you? Come on now. What matters? Priorities. And then, lastly, receive God's vision for your life or for life in general. So he tells them, you pick, you go left, you go right, whatever you want. And so this is what Lot does. Catch these words. Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the Garden of Eden. like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east, and thus they separated from each other. So let's stop there for a moment, and let's talk about what Lot did. He did. Abram said, you pick the best. Lot looked up, eyes up, looked around. What is the best financial provision situation for my family? The best financial situation for my family is that area over there. That area right there, they've got access to springs, they've got rivers, it's lush, it's fertile, it's perfect for everything I want to do. That's the best of the land. I want the best. Now, how many of you have ever been in that spot? I want the best. Anybody ever want the best for your life? Come on now. I want the best. I want the best. If I have a choice between the best and second best, I choose the best. This is what Lot chose. He used his eyes. He looked up. It says he lifted his eyes and he looked. What's the best situation for my family? And using the eyes exactly the way Satan tempted Eve in the garden. She used her eyes. She looked and saw that the fruit looked good. Good for food. Pleasant to the eyes. Good for making one wise. And she took. Guys, that decision cost Lot everything. Everything. He used worldly wisdom. He used what looked right in his own eyes, and it cost him everything. He ends up losing everything, even his family. The world invites you, invites me, calls me to use my worldly wisdom, my eyes, to figure out what is best for me. Draws me into that conversation all the time. What's best for you? What's going to be the best? Hey, look over here. What's the best financial situation for our family? And says that is the same thing as the blessing of God. And I propose it's not. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes. Now this is God talking. This is God talking to Abram. Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Lot lifted up his own eyes and looked for what was best. What's the best situation for my family? This is what looks the best. This is going to give us the most financial provision. This is going to, whatever it is, and I'm moving there. And God says to Abram, now lift, I want to give you vision for your life. I want you to see what I see. And he began to speak over Abram's life, reminding him who he is, reminding him of the promise. And he said, I want you to go walk. I want you to go take a walk. I want you to see it. I want you to know it, what is coming for you. And it says that he settled in this place by the oaks of Mamre. Mamre means vision. In the land of Hebron, Hebron means communion. Because vision, God's vision for your life flows out of communion with God. And that's what he invites you into. It is not that God wants to hold out on any of us. Are you with me? But God has a vision for your life. What is God's vision for your life? If you want to know what that is, how to get that, it's like this. God's vision flows from communion. God's vision flows from communion. It comes from delighting yourself in Him and Him giving you the desires of your heart. And the order of Psalm 37 is so important. It's a whole psalm about trust, but delight yourself in the Lord and He'll give you the desires of your heart is the order of how that works. If we'll delight ourselves in Him, if we'll commune with God, meet with God, worship God, He will then begin to speak to our heart about desires, about what He has. And those desires will be in alignment with God's desires. But it all flows from communion with God. There is a vision for your life and your family. And that vision is not synonymous with what is the best financial situation for you to decide on. It may be. But that is not how we live our lives as the people of God. This story of Abram brings us all the way back to reminding us who we are and who He is to us. And if He is our provider, then we can decide differently about how to move forward as a family, as people, what decisions we make. But those decisions come from time with God, the presence of God. A couple were fighting over inheritance rights, and they said to Jesus, tell them this and that. And Jesus just responds, He says, take care, be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. One's life, say it with me, one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. One more time. One's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Life. One's life, my life. That which brings meaning, that which brings fulfillment, that which matters beyond tomorrow does not consist in my possessions. That which has eternal value, that which outlives me, does not consist in my possessions. God has a fantastic plan for you, an incredible vision for your life. Right now, He does. And He's inviting you to know Him and to learn to trust Him.